Happy International Women's Day. I have got a few tips, I guess some thoughts on Balance for Better, and a few top tips for women in terms of how we thrive, how we be our best, and not just today on International Women's Day, but all year round. So today this year the theme for International Women's Day is Balance for Better, and it's something that I really want to start with because I work with big groups of women. I talk a lot about women, but a lot of the things that I talk about, the challenges we overcome, they impact men as well. And when we talk about equality, when we talk about women thriving, obviously that depends on men as well. They are such a big part of our lives, big part of our communities and our workforces. And Balance for Better is a way of helping emphasize this. So for me, it's not about the downfall of men. Equality for women is not about the downfall of men. It's everybody's business, equality, and it's everybody's job. Equality for women is not something that will be solved by big groups of women meeting and trying to solve this problem alone. We really need to bring our men on the journey with us, particularly in the workplace. And I know that we've heard a lot of media coverage, particularly on the back of the Me Too movement, and we hear a lot of media coverage of what happens when guys get it wrong. And yes, we do hear abhorrent stories from women of bullying, sexual harassment, discrimination, sexual assault. But we also have the flip side of that where men get it right. And I've spoken to a lot of women over the last year, particularly from a workplace point of view, where they've had great male mentors. They've had sponsors and cheerleaders almost from within their organisation that have been male. And it's important that we don't overlook this because, yes, International Women's Day is all about women, but Balance for Better is the theme. And it is all about a gender-balanced society, a gender-balanced workplace where we get equal opportunities. Having said that though, things are different for women. We are paid differently still. We are judged differently. We have different expectations placed on us. We are still, many of us, in a position where we are doing the lion's share of the housework, the child rearing, the social engagements, the organising, as well as full-time jobs. And we beat ourselves up about this a lot of the time. It's really a difficult position to be in, especially if you're a mother, to want a career and not feel guilty for not being at the gates at 3 p.m. every day for the kids, or vice versa, to be at the gates 3 p.m. and to have chosen actually I'm going to be a full-time mum and not a career and not climb the career ladder and not feel guilty for not contributing financially or for having other interests outside of what we do for our kids. So it's no wonder we feel like we can't win. Quite simply, if you're walking in a woman's shoes, life will be different than if you were a man wearing exactly the same shoes, particularly in the workplace. So there's some research done by the Rockefeller Foundation around CEOs and gender. And when something goes wrong in a business, when a business has a crisis, if a woman is at the helm in a CEO role, she's blamed 80% of the time in the media. A man in the same role, when something goes wrong, when there's a crisis, 31% of the time. There's a big difference. It's how we're judged. And we know that women at work, we're taught, be more assertive, but you might get labelled a bully. Show your vulnerability, but don't be too weak. And throughout all this, be your authentic self as well. It's a really fine line to tread, and there are different expectations on us. We are judged differently. Who are our worst critics? Who judges us most harshly? Who thinks it's not okay to ask for help, and who has the expectations of us right up here? Quite often, that's ourselves, particularly as women. So what can we do in light of International Women's Day 2019 to be our best, to thrive at life and at work? Here are some top tips to help with that. Number one, be yourself and let that be enough. And this is so much easier said than done, but it's about making decisions that are in line with our values, who we are as people, what means the most to us, what ignites our passion and what matters to us, making sure that our schedules actually match our priorities, our real priorities. We're always feeling like we're not good enough, and we're always trying to fit into a mold or to fit a norm, an expectation that we feel we must follow to be more clever, more rich, more pretty. We want to be stronger, fitter, thinner, higher up the career ladder. And quite often this constant push for what we feel we should be doing leaves us feeling like an expat in a foreign country. We don't belong. And like we're adrift from what really matters to us. And it can be exhausting. Tapping into who we are and giving ourselves permission to be that person makes life so much more enjoyable, and it's how we thrive. Speaking up, leaning in, taking risks, backing ourselves, that's the next tip. This is something that as women often we stand back instead of leaning in. We wait for situations to be perfect before we take the opportunity. That little bit more experience before we apply for the promotion. Waiting for that idea to be 100% perfect before we share it with the team. And when we do this, we find that actually somebody else gets in there first and we lose that opportunity. Similarly with our presence, if we're speaking up, if we're being noticed, it helps our brand. And so often we can feel like sometimes we're waiting for someone to give us permission to do that. Sometimes we have to back ourselves and say, yep, I'm going to take that risk and I'm going to back myself to succeed, because that's how we grow and develop. Getting outside of our comfort zone and facing those challenges, facing the fear and doing it anyway, proving that we are competent. But it's easier said than done, and generally fear is why. So facing our fear is a key part. Tip number 3. We have so many fears, particularly if we are taking on a challenge or leaning in. We fear what might go wrong. We fear, what if we fail? What will people think? We fear the unknown. There are so many things. We can be guilty of playing it safe to avoid this fear of failure, not even asking so that we don't get rejected. It's called our comfort zone, and it's that name for a reason. It feels comfortable. It feels safe. We have this better the devil you know than the devil you don't. And quite often it stops us taking those steps outside of our comfort zone because we feel uncomfortable. But that's how we grow. It's also, though, how we risk failure. And this is one of the big things that holds us back. We don't want to fail so desperately that sometimes we won't even try. Yet, my relationship with failure has changed over the years to something that, instead of avoiding it at all costs, because let's face it, I used to think that if we didn't fail, we'd be successful by default. However, if we give ourselves permission to fail, we'll take on more challenges. We're human, we're going to make mistakes at some point. Everybody fails, even those that are successful, those we aspire to be. It's not that they're doing it right and we're doing it wrong. They've failed, they've learned from their failures, their mistakes, and that's how they've succeeded. And quite often, failure can be a lesson. That's something that has really come home to me in the last few years. When we fail, we learn. And sometimes that is how we succeed. Because if we didn't learn that lesson, we would never have known what we needed to do to be successful. Now, this is really difficult if we're perfectionists. And letting go of perfection is tip number 4. Because if we are that frightened of failure, we may find ourselves right at the other extreme. If failure's here, we want to be as far away as possible. And this is where we fall into the perfection trap. Everything has to be perfect, otherwise it's a failure in our eyes. And of course we know that perfection isn't always possible. We live in a very imperfect world. The way we look, the things we do, life, our plans, everything has that edge of imperfection to it. Yet quite often we aspire to be perfect. We want everything to go to plan. We want that letter to have 0 mistakes in it. We want to look like a perfect airbrush picture of a magazine. And so often, the irony, of course, is we set ourselves up to fail. We want to be as far away from failure as possible, so we try to be perfect, and it doesn't exist, and we end up failing. Navigating perfectionism isn't about not doing a good job. It's about knowing where the expectations are. So resetting the bar to a realistic level, knowing that sometimes done is better than perfect, and knowing that we can deliver real quality work and do something really well without it being perfect. But it's easier said than done because we are a breed of people pleasers. We compare ourselves to others, but we also want to please everybody around us, whether it be our parents, our teachers, our bosses, our partners, our families. We want to inherently please people. And what that means is that we always want to do a good job. We want to exceed expectations all the time, but we know where this leads. It leads to burnout, to being too busy, to taking on too much, to overwhelm, to feeling like there's not enough hours in the day. And that's tip number 5, balancing our inner superwoman, because we do have these tendencies to be, not just do everything, but to do it perfectly and to be all things to all people. And it isn't sustainable. It's why we burn out. It's why we're exhausted all the time. And eventually all those balls that we're juggling, one drops. Resilience is key, as is putting ourselves first. And for people pleasers, this is really hard. Having good boundaries, delegating, being able to say no, are all really key ways of balancing this busyness and this overwhelm. But we have this attachment to being busy, Being busy, you know, it's attached to our self-worth. Being busy is something that makes us feel needed, makes us feel valued, and it's, our society has taught us it's how we're productive. So to not be busy, the opposite of that, we feel lazy, we feel selfish. It's something that we tend to steer away from. So when we start taking time out for ourselves, when we start putting in place those boundaries, focusing on our resilience, it can often be competing against our busy badge of honor. But it's how we succeed. It's how we put ourselves in the best space possible to deal with all these competing demands. Because without it, we're always trying to fend off burnout and exhaustion. Tip number 6 is celebrating our success. This is something that as women we're not great at. We live in a society where we're taught to downplay our achievements, to be modest, to not boast. We don't want to be seen as a tall poppy. And we also have a tendency to focus on the negative. We spend a lot of time thinking about the things we're not good at, the things that we haven't got, the things that haven't gone well, the things that we don't like about ourselves. And this is at the expense of all of the good things we have to celebrate, the things that we love about ourselves, the things that are going well in life, the things that we're lucky to have, our strengths, our successes. How often have you stopped and looked back at the last week and thought about the things that have gone really well? How often have you told somebody else about this at work, at home, without feeling like you're boasting or waving away those successes and saying things like, it was actually nothing, or it was down to the team, or it was just luck? Remember to celebrate your success, because if you're getting praise, recognition, you deserve it. That's your achievement. So celebrate it. And if it feels weird at first, start by just saying thank you. That's a really good start. And make sure you're reflecting each week, each month, and at the end of every year on the things that have gone well, because we don't spend enough time doing this, and we need to retrain the brain so that it gets into the habit of doing more of this and sharing it with others. And last but not least, in the spirit of balance for better, we are more powerful together than we are apart, and that's irrespective of our gender. So we are taught a lot of the time that we must compete against each other and that our success must be at the expense of somebody else's. But we are so much more powerful together than we are apart. And when we're talking about equality for women, when we're talking about being our best, this is even more important both in life and the workplace. So leverage that, because we are all in this together. Happy International Women's Day.